How do you tell if a piece of furniture is solid wood or veneered? Let's have a look at some examples. This is our dining table and it's solid wood. The wood is elm. How do I know it's solid wood? I can see the long grain or the side grain of the wood along the length of the table, and then I can see end grain where I would expect to see end grain. The frame of the table is also solid wood. This is beech. This table is by Urkel. It's a vintage mid-century piece and they're well known for their solid wood furniture. This is our coffee table. It's solid wood too. I know that because I made it. This top is one solid piece of beech, and again I can see long grain running the length of the tabletop and end grain at the ends. Another example would be a solid wood kitchen worktop. The one in the picture is made up of solid wood staves, finger jointed together, and I can be pretty confident that this is solid wood because again at the end of the worktops I can see the end grain of each piece of wood. Now let's look at some veneered examples. This mid-century modern cocktail cabinet is veneered. But what is a veneer? Well, basically it means that a very thin layer of real wood has been laminated or glued to some sort of engineered board substrate. The substrate could be chipboard, blockboard, plywood or MDF. Veneers are usually very thin, often around 0.5 millimeter. Here's a piece of walnut veneer, and if I glued this to a piece of plywood, then I'd have a walnut veneered board ready for use in a project. How do I know it's veneered? Well, take this top panel for example. I can see the long grain of the wood running in this direction, and then at the end of the board where I'd expect to see end grain, instead what I can see is long grain again running in this direction. That suggests to me that this is some sort of engineered board, probably plywood or chipboard, with a veneer applied to this face and another veneer applied to the end of the board, which is also known as edge banding to hide the substrate of the board, i.e. the MDF, chipboard, plywood or blockboard core. Often with furniture like this though, it isn't entirely veneered. Some of the smaller components like the legs and the apron rails are all made of solid wood, but the larger panels like the top, sides and doors are all veneered boards. Another example is this veneered chest of drawers. This is a sapele veneer on chipboard, and I found this chest of drawers dumped in an alleyway in a bad state, and I restored it in a previous video. And once again I can see the long grain running this way and then no end grain where I'd expect to see end grain. Instead it looks like a blockboard core with a solid wood lipping. And again some of the smaller components like these handles and the sides of the drawer boxes are made up of solid wood, whereas the carcass of the drawers and the drawer fronts are all veneered boards. Here's another example of a veneered piece. I made this corner cabinet in a recent video too. And I made this using some veneered plywood, although some of the solid wood trim around the edges of the doors, the lipping at the front of the top and bottom panel, and the legs are all solid wood. There also might be situations where it's difficult to tell whether it's solid wood or not, like with this bedside table I have here, where the sides have been mitered to the top so that no end grain is visible. I know that the drawer boxes are solid wood, but as for the carcass, well, there's no real way of telling without cutting into it, and I'm not about to do that. Figuring out whether a piece of furniture is solid wood or veneered isn't always that simple though, as some modern furniture manufacturers have figured out ways to make veneered wood look more like solid wood by actually gluing on pieces of end grain to the end of the substrate boards. Let's see if we can replicate that in my workshop. I took a block of MDF and a piece of oak, and I'm going to cut only about 10 millimeters off the end of the oak at the miter saw. I'm going to glue and clamp this onto the end of the MDF. I applied glue to the top face of the MDF and the piece of oak at the end, and added a piece of oak veneer on top, making sure it's overlapping on all edges. I'll use another piece of MDF just to get even clamping pressure and clamp it up in my vise. After a few hours I can remove the excess veneer by cutting it away with a sharp knife. And I cut away the excess oak too at the bandsaw. I used my block plane to flush up the edges of the veneer with the MDF. And then I laminated more oak veneer to the side of the block. Again I used a piece of MDF, and this time a weight, just to apply pressure until the glue was dry. I can trim away the excess veneer once again. And then I did a bit of sanding just to help blend in the veneers and ease over the sharp edges. Finally, I applied my own handmade oil wax finish to the block, which by the way is for sale in my Etsy store, links down below. So be honest, can you tell this is not a block of solid wood?
Okay, so the face grain of the wood doesn't line up perfectly with the end grain, but at a glance, would you really be able to tell the difference? And here's a prime example of where I believe this technique has been used. This is an Ikea worktop clearly labelled as ash/veneer, and on closer inspection you can see that the solid wood veneer is actually pretty thick, but you can see that the end grain has been glued onto the substrate of the board to make it look like solid wood. When you read the product information, it shows that the substrate of the worktop is particle board, also known as chipboard.
I often hear people, especially woodworkers, talking about veneered furniture in a derogatory way, as if it's the work of the devil, but I really don't see it that way, so I thought it'd be worth looking at the advantages and disadvantages of both solid wood and veneered boards. Solid wood is great because it's solid wood, so it's easier to repair. If it gets damaged in some way, you can remove material from it to expose new wood underneath to get rid of any imperfections before applying a new finish on top. I have some videos about how to choose a wood finish, and if you'd like to check those out, there'll be links down below in the description box. The downside of solid wood though is that it expands and contracts across the grain with humidity changes. It swells across the grain when it absorbs moisture and shrinks when it dries out. And that can result in problems. Boards can crack or pop if they're constrained or restricted, either structurally or by mechanical fixings, if the movement of the wood has not been accounted for properly by the maker of the piece. Even wood which has a film finish applied will still expand and contract. There's not really anything you can do about it, that's just how it behaves. Veneered board is great because the substrate of the board that the veneer is attached to is completely stable. Whether it's MDF, plywood or chipboard, it won't expand or contract. Well, not significantly enough to cause any problems anyway. So expansion and contraction will never be an issue. It's also a more cost-effective solution as it allows furniture makers to use expensive and sometimes exotic timbers as veneers in much smaller quantities, as the bulk of the material can be the much cheaper substrate of the board. The downside of veneer is that when it gets damaged, particularly if it's a really thin piece of veneer, it's a more specialist repair job, as you might need to try and grain match the wood and patch in a new piece of veneer, like I did on this corner cabinet that I made recently. There are other options like using some kind of a filler or a hard wax stick if it's a relatively small repair. Sometimes veneer can also start to peel off, which is unlikely to happen in normal conditions, but if a piece of furniture has been exposed to damp conditions or high temperatures, or if the piece is really old, the glue holding the veneer to the substrate can start to fail and the veneer can lift. That's it for this one. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos. If you'd like to help support the channel, plus get early access to my videos, exclusive content, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos, you can find links to my Patreon page and YouTube channel membership in the description box below. Thanks for watching.